Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Star Freud Wellness Podcast. And I am your host, Star Freudenberg. And if this is the first time you're tuning into this podcast, I'd like to say a warm welcome to you. And I talk about all topics surrounding health, wellness, and I specialize mainly in detox, and detox being in all forms: mind, body, soul, energy, physical, quantum level, etc., the energy field. So every week I'll be releasing a different episode surrounding a theme or a subject that I'm sort of indulged in for that week, or it's been a subject on my mind, and just a lot of information about education that I want to pass on to you. And hopefully you'll take something from it. Otherwise, I don't think I'll be continuing these podcasts. So for today's topic, I want to talk about gut health again, because it's a big theme. And I want to talk about how it's sort of becoming a lot more mainstream at the moment. And there's a big spotlight on fermenting your foods. Right. So if you are going anywhere or heard anything about gut health, I am almost certain that you've heard about something linked with, fermentation, or sort of linking around the themes of the top foods that are good for you that are fermented. So I think more of Asian countries, and you might think of the foods such as kimchi, or you might have heard of the drink called kombucha, or very popular now, and I see very very popularly advertised in the tubes, is a yogurt company advertising kefir, which is fermented yogurt, and it's a fermented milk that you drink. Or you can have yogurt itself, or in Germany, you get sauerkraut, or in Japan, you'll get miso, or maybe France and sort of anywhere now, you get cheese, or you can get sourdough bread or vinegar. And I think when I think of vinegar, I think of anything pickled. And these are like sort of the nine or so top foods that are ranked for fermentation. But then you can also go deeper, and are again going sort of back to Japan. Then we're thinking of tempeh. We're thinking of tofu. I'm thinking of soy sauce. We're thinking of soya. We're thinking of beans. So fermentation has been around for a very, very, very long time. And it's very popularized that you can make it at home. And obviously, when you make things at home, you know what's actually going into it, and it makes it a lot more natural and a lot more healthier. And you go, well, what is all the big hype about fermentation? And in essence, fermentation, or fermenting foods, or fermented foods, contain a lot of microbes. Because we have about 38 trillion microbes in our gut, or at least should be having 38 trillion microbes in our gut that are functioning well. And we need to feed them. In order to feed them, they need these kind of foods, lots of external foods from different environments that are co-creating, and then they can come into your gut and really, really enhance your gut. And so I think what is happening now, because gut health finally is becoming a lot more mainstream and a lot more buzzword, and people a lot more comfortable about talking about that, they have a lot of gas, they have bloating, they feel tired, the way they're going to the toilet and releasing their bowels is difficult, or maybe they have hemorrhoids, or maybe they're constipated and they don't go to the toilet every day, in which you should be going at least twice a day, just by the way. And there's lots of different, and then you have the extreme cases of people who have irritable bowel syndrome, or constant diarrhea, or a high sensitivity to certain foods, or parasites. The list is endless, really. And so now I think, because people are becoming a lot more active, and, their ears are peaked with, I call it the bunny ears, or up and listening, for anything gut health, it's becoming a lot more popularized, or a lot of classes or master classes or workshops are, people sort of trying to take you back to the basics and say, like, let's go to the traditional ways of, what people used to do when they used to preserve their food, when fridges weren't around and freezers didn't exist, and, sort of the natural ways of how to look after your food and make it last longer, especially during the winter months. And so fermentation sort of was created back then. And now the issue I particularly am having, and no one seems to be talking about, and maybe this is just coming and linking in because I'm doing a combination of modalities that I'm starting to recognize patterns, is when I go into Western medicine where I do blood tests, and I find, and through blood sample analysis, I find people's many different things, but in this context, allergies to food, as well as intolerances to food. And so I need to obviously say this because a lot of people approach me and they're like, oh, can I just do an intolerance test to foods? And I'm like, it's not really sufficient. You should definitely do your allergies to food as well. And then people always go, well, what's the difference and why? And for me is you can be allergic to something, not intolerant. You can be intolerant to something and not allergic. And you can be both. You can be intolerant and allergic to something. So it's really, really helpful advice because the most common allergies I see, and allergies is the severe one, which could have anaphylactic associations with it, or really severe abdominal cramping, or the most common autoimmune reactions, which I see is like psoriasis and eczema, etc. And the thing is that when someone has an intolerance, and the most common is to cow's milk, is then people opt for plant-based milks, right? So I always go with this good analogy. And then, for example, they'll have almond milk or cashew nut milk or da-da-da-da milk. But then the problem within that is then if you don't know your common nut allergies, then you'll be swapping from one disaster to something even more severe. So I really, really, see the benefit in doing both. And it's sort of like, I say it's a very powerful health information tool, because from that then you will be able to start making more educated health-based decisions and not guesswork. And also from research and studies, they do say that sometimes it can take up to 3 days for symptoms to express themselves in the body from having a reaction to a food. Depending on the severity of your, let's call it the severity scale of your allergy to a certain food or food group, or in this case, nuts I was just using, those symptoms can even show quite immediately or even within an hour. And I always say to people, if you're like at a party, you're going on holiday and you're faced with certain decision making where it's an allergy or an intolerance, best case scenario would be to avoid, but most likely you won't. But then I always say opt for the intolerance, because in terms of the punishment on your body, it's going to be a lot less severe. You will still be uncomfortable and experience symptoms, but it'll be a lot less severe than having an allergic reaction or a minor allergic reaction. So just sort of putting that in your think tank. Now, I've been doing these blood tests for quite a number of years. And the benefit in the data that I get is seeing patterns. And I always say to people, without doubt, and almost like I would call it 8 to 9 times out of 10, I see these top 4 intolerances that people are responding to. And as I mentioned earlier, number 1 will be cow's milk. Then I see wheat/gluten. Then I see eggs, and that could be eggs in its entirety or a split between egg white or egg yolk. And then last but not least, so most people sort of expect the dairy and the wheat, because again, this is what mainstream gut health buzzwords are going around. So people are like avoiding it literally like the plague. But the unsuspected is eggs, which is often disappointing because people love eggs. It's very easy. Especially to make in the morning, and also it's blended in. It's part of a mixture of many, many things in terms of cooked with both sweet and savory foods. But that is quite straightforward in understanding in terms of what you can eliminate from your diet. But for the purpose of this discussion today, I want to talk about the 4th one that literally, like I said, 8 to 9 times out of 10 pops up, which is yeast. Right. So yeast, and you go, ooh, everyone's like, yeast? And they just go, oh, yeast is in bread. And may I tell you, it is not just in bread. It is found in many, many, many things. And often I'll say if it's baked things that obviously need food to rise. So we can think of maybe cakes, we think of breads. A very unsuspected one is mushrooms, in which you can find yeast in. And also the different places you can find it. So yeast is part of the fermentation. This is where I'm going with my argument. You need yeast, and yeast is like a key core function to support fermentation, right? And I'm going to read you a couple more examples of yeast, because I actually did write them down on a document, because there's always so many things to remember when you're on here speaking. But yeast is part of a key function in fermentation process. And I've been posing this question for a very, very long time, because I myself am a sufferer of yeast intolerance. And so with the education that I've been gaining surrounding colonics and gut health and nutrition and diet, for my own personal experience, I have figured out through, let's call it experimenting on myself, what does work and what does not work within a yeast intolerant environment within the body. And I have worked out anything pickled, anything with vinegar, anything aged. So we're thinking about cheeses, we're thinking about fungi, which is mushrooms. We're thinking about now all of these delicious things. So we're thinking soy, we're thinking tofu, we're thinking tempeh, we're thinking soy sauce, we're thinking, what am I thinking? I'm thinking sauerkraut, I'm thinking kimchi, I'm thinking kombucha, I'm thinking yogurt, I'm thinking miso. And then I'm thinking, how deep does this rabbit hole go? Because then it's eliminating quite a significant number of, let's call it cultural dishes. So when I go and I think to Japanese food, and I was just in Japan in October, it's like, wow, that's last year. I was like, wow, I literally have to avoid this almost entire cultures of food, because everything that they consume has some form of fermentation, which then I go, wow, no wonder why they're quite a healthy nation, and their gut health might be, in summary, quite good, because they've been supporting their body with these fermented and aka microbes and really good gut supporting and nourishing environment their entire lives. They've been brought up with it. But it's so common that in the West, we are lacking in our biome for different reasons, and that's genetics. That's mostly because we're in an a pandemic about, living in an environment with processed and super ultra processed foods, that even foods that should look like normal food, like maybe a piece of meat, that's not really meat anymore. And the same with how fruits and veg are grown. So our food quality is like super compromised with things being genetically modified. The chemicals that are used, or the pesticides, insecticides, fungicides that are used to obviously grow the crop. I think about the chemicals that are used to keep things stored. So I think about grains and how they're stored in the silos to prevent any infestation of maybe rats, insects, bugs. And then obviously the different processes in terms of logistics that it has to go through, being frozen and then transported, and then it's just really such a nightmare when you actually think about it. And then you think about the water that's used, and all water is really polluted and contaminated as well. And obviously most businesses, their bottom line is to make profit. So they're going to do everything possible to grow as many crops as possible at as low cost as possible, to try and get the best profit. And if that means cutting corners and doing things that are not really friendly on the environment / the body, they are doing it, right? And the unfortunate issue is that we're just so oblivious, so unaware, and not really speaking up about it, or like talking more about it. So we need to just really, really think about this. But again, coming back to yeast. So what I've written down here is it's what I've called this is a PDF that I send to clients. So when they find out, or when I recognize that they have a yeast intolerance, this is the guide I send them. So yeast intolerance is a living fungus, which is used as an active ingredient in many products, especially baked products. Oh yes, and of course the main one I didn't mention is alcoholic drinks. So bakers use yeast to make dough rise, and brewers use yeast to ferment sugar to alcohol. So yeast can also be present on foods naturally, and it often grows on the skins of berries and soft fruits. And that's why you'll easily see it mold and have that fungus-like effect if you obviously leave it too long. So if you have a yeast intolerance, you also may, I always have to say may, or you also may react to fungus-containing foods such as mushrooms, truffles, blue cheese, what blue cheese is, and malt. And obviously the most misconception is when people, again, as I said, think yeast, they just go, "Ooh, okay, I can't have bread." I'm like, it's a much deeper rabbit hole than that, because in this context, alcohol is a hugely available, let's call it, source out there that I think almost everyone does and engages in. And to some extent, some people use alcohol as a stress relief. It's used as a social interaction. Let's call it support. It's a very easy thing to get. And again, it does contain yeast. So yeast, and then I always say to people about beer, if you want to drink alcohol, you need to try avoid beer as much as possible, because that has a really much higher content in terms of yeast compared to different types of alcohols like spirits or wines. So yes, bread isn't the only thing you need to avoid when you're on a yeast-free diet. And there are really some surprising foods you shouldn't eat. So if you have a positive reaction to yeast, you should remove yeast and fungus-containing foods from your diet, and also cut down on sugary foods which can fuel the growth of natural yeast in the body, such as candida. And now candida is like for a whole separate podcast, but candida is a bacterial overgrowth in the body. We do have candida in our body. We have it in our mouth, we have it in our gut, and for women, we have it in our vaginas. But the issue, like anything, when something is at an imbalance, aka too much or too little, that is when problems or imbalances start to arise and dysbiosis starts to occur, so imbalance in the gut. So that's a side thing. So yeast intolerance can then add on to a candida candida overgrowth. And this is where people need to start thinking, okay, yeast-free diet, and then also start incorporating something called a low FODMAP diet. And people say to me, what's low FODMAP? So, it basically is an acronym. And having a low FODMAP diet, and I think just before I start getting into what FODMAP is, I just don't want to get distracted and just continue on the yeast path of my yeast document. And it's quite interesting. So yeast can also be called hydrolyzed yeast protein or hydrolyzed yeast vegetable protein, or leavening as well. So how to avoid it? So when we're thinking basic foods, I'm going to then give you a food type. I'll tell you what to avoid and what you can consider having as a substitute. So when we go into breads, we're thinking foods to avoid. We're thinking breads, we're thinking pizza bases, we're thinking pastries, we're thinking croissants, bagels, yeast-containing flatbreads such as pita and naan, mostly or most sourdough. So usually sourdough has quite a low yeast content, so it's like the lesser of the two evils. But of course trying to avoid that as much as possible. And then get pumpernickel breads. Yeast-free foods you can consider in terms of breads is yeast-free breads using baking powder or bicarb or bicarbonate of soda, or yeast-free flatbreads such as matzah, which is it's like a cracker bread that is catered usually towards the Jewish market because of sort of background within that, and then flour tortillas. So nuts to avoid in terms of yeast is peanuts and peanut containing products, and unfortunately as well, which is for me, is pistachios. And the reason for peanut specifically is because peanut is not really framed in terms of being a nut, but it's actually framed as being a legume. And then sort of other nuts are sort of on the okay list. Yes. Then we move on to fruits. And fruits, especially you should avoid if they are overripe and you start to notice a little bit of fur, or they have that sort of, I don't know if you've ever tasted, like when you eat a fruit that's a bit overripe, then it starts to have sort of an alcoholic taste. So that is when it's starting to go into that fermentation stage, and aka yeast abundant stage. So you want to avoid that. You also want to avoid dried fruits such as figs, dates, raisins, and apricots. In terms of yeast-free foods, on the good list for fruit is tropical fruits, kiwi, papaya, mango, pineapple. Going back to the avoid list, in terms of vegetables, you want to avoid mushrooms and truffles, fungi-like foods. What is okay is frozen food, tinned vegetables, vegetable juice, peas, beans, lentils are still okay, and then salad-like vegetables. In the naughty list, in terms of cheese, we're thinking of ripe foods or blue cheeses. We're thinking brie, we're thinking camembert. So when you see that like white waxy coating, that's all of a yeast. That's a fermented process, in which maggots, from how I've been taught as a child, it's basically maggots on top creating the barrier around the cheese, which helps support it becoming moldy. So my dad, being French, has always taught me to never ever eat the skin of the brie camembert whenever you are around. But then I've seen people over the years just eat it anyway, and they say it's good for your gut. So I mean, it might be, it is for sure, but maybe not for your gut if you have a yeast intolerance. Right. In terms of on the good list, we've got eggs and dairy. So eggs you can have. Soy milk you can have, cottage cheese, plain organic live yogurt. That's eggs and dairy. So when we go to meat and fish on the no list, on the naughty list, we got anything that's been pickled, smoked and dried, whether it's fish, meat, poultry, and then also sushi. And like I say, just for the different reasons of the soy sauce, fish sauce, and then there might be different fermented foods, such as the ginger as well. So in terms of meat and fish on the good list, we've got fresh poultry, lamb, pork, beef, veal, mackerel, sardines, cod, salmon, herring, tuna, trout. So it's all okay. Now, the trickiest one, I think, what people don't really know, and this is the really big, I didn't know that kind of moment, is condiments, right? There's a lot of yeast containing or pickled vinegar bases within the condiments, so we just need to be a little bit more mindful of that. And I always think it's always best, if possible, not to consume condiments because they got high sugars, they've got a lot of processed ingredients inside, a lot of artificial ingredients and chemicals, etc. So it's not always the best unless it's really like a farmer's market homemade, could expire next week kind of product, but just being mindful. Another one people don't often know, but Marmite as well contains yeast because it has a yeast extract. Equivalent is also Vegemite, Bovril. Also the big, not nice and pleasant ones, is also stock cubes and stock gravies just all have yeast inside, so it's best to try and find one that contains no yeast. There are possible ones, but not always easy to source, especially in just normal traditional shops. Vinegar containing foods. Now, anything pickled, anything relished, mayonnaise, Worcestershire sauce, horseradish, grainy mustard, chili sauce, salad dressing. So yeah, it's quite a lot of different things, but just being mindful of that. Drinks, we want to avoid fermented alcohol, beer, wines, cider, some spirits, tempeh, miso, tamari, which is a fermented soybean, fruit juices in the carton, but if you can have freshly squeezed juice, that's okay. And then we sort of just go on the other list. So bakers and brewers yeast, quite blatantly, quite obvious. Some nutritional supplements, textured vegetable protein, hydrolyzed vegetable protein, a leavening agent, which will be based on a yeast extract, which is usually added for flavor, or hydrolyzed yeast. On the good list for other, you can have yeast-free pancakes and crepes, rice cakes, oat cakes, corn tortilla, tacos, some rye crisp breads, rye vita, non-fermented soy, whether it's corn or tofu, pasta, brown rice, brown flours, corn, milk rice, buckwheat, couscous, barley, millet, and quinoa. In terms of yeast-free breakfast replacements to consider, you can have eggs on organic crisp bread, or plain organic live yogurt, fat-free Greek yogurt, soya cheese, cottage cheese, nut butters, obviously not peanut, that can be placed on porridge or crisp bread. Yeast-free lunch and dinner replacements, so there's buckwheat soba noodles, rice noodles, pasta, potatoes, oat cakes and hummus, brown rice tortillas, homemade soups using yeast-free stock, wraps using lettuce leaves, fresh meat and vegetables, homemade bean salads, cottage cheese, fish pâté with butter beans and olive oil. Removing yeast and keeping a balanced diet is obviously key. Even though yeast is a good source of vitamins, including B vitamins, that of course will need to be replaced. So you can obviously have like a supplement such as B complex, etc. Staple foods such as bread can be replaced with yeast-free breads. It is possible, such as soda bread, corn tortillas, and rye crisp breads. And some examples of yeast-free foods, I'm just going to be repeating myself here, but it's rice, corn tortilla, poultry, fish, cottage cheese, rice cakes, crisp breads, beef, eggs, plain yogurt, oat cakes, fresh vegetables, lamb, and soy milk. Right, so that's a good summary about yeast-free. And then now the next thing is with people, when they are on a yeast-free diet, they do end up, when they have a yeast intolerance, almost aligned is then they suffer from an imbalance called candida. And candida, like I said, is a bacterial overgrowth, which then people need to consider going on something called a low FODMAP diet. And you may have heard of FODMAP diet, maybe from a friend, or maybe overheard of it on the internet, or again, it's not something new, it's quite old. And then when people say FODMAP diet, again, it will imply that they're on it's usually low in FODMAP, which basically has certain sugars, reducing certain sugars in your body that usually causes intestinal distress. So these types of diets are usually designed to help people with symptoms of an irritable bowel, and or suffering with something called SIBO, which is small intestinal bacterial overgrowth. And basically, by eliminating these foods, by following a low FODMAP diet, will help people figure out which foods are problematic, and then obviously in tandem try help you to reduce the symptoms you're suffering from. So the issue I would say around low FODMAP diet is that it should be a temporary diet. Most things in terms of eliminating and reducing should be temporary to sort of help through trial and error basis figure out what is it you need to avoid and what it is that is triggering you, and to what extent you can start having small quantities. And just on that note, so I don't forget, so Monash University have done a lot of research and they've created an app which you can find on the Apple Store and Google Play Store, which is super helpful. So if you need to follow low FODMAP diet, and the issue with low FODMAP is it is very restrictive, but through this research Monash University have done is they're saying that, and really put it on a really nice like traffic light system going like, this food is red, you can't do it, or it's amber, or it's green. So it's really, really helpful. But even within the red category, they've gone and then dug deeper to say, okay, you can have these foods, whether it's green, amber, or red, but at a restrictive quantity per meal. So then you can think to yourself, and I'll just use an example now, I can have like a teaspoon of kimchi, and it's very small in quantity, but I'll take what I can get, right? And that's the same extension to you. So trying to figure out how to reduce the environment that's being irritated through all the different food groups and trying to keep it as low as possible, so then we can repair and build, and then we can start introducing foods with the idea that then eventually you can eat what you want, but not every day at every meal. Sort of, maybe a treat-like concept where you have it maybe once a week or once a month or something like that whilst working with your body, right? Another thing I also experience is about how people just pendulum between diets, and like, oh, I heard this new diet, so I'm trying it, or I heard that new diet, I'm trying it. It's really important to speak to a healthcare professional or nutritionist or dietitian or a naturopath, someone such as myself, to figure out what is a good diet for you to follow. And time and time again, I get people coming, I'm very unwell, they do the blood tests, and through the blood tests I can already see, and obviously through consultation and medical questions and etc., and figuring out what's their profile and what their illnesses are or symptoms are, and understanding that they're not following the right lifestyle, diet and behavior for what their constitution needs. And often I will see cases of people making decisions to be vegan, vegetarian, and it's really detrimental to the health. Or people, for example, it makes me giggle, but often have to tell people who are Indian that they can't eat Indian food, and it's just sort of like a complete mind boggler. Or telling people that maybe it's better to follow a Mediterranean based diet or a complete elimination between wheat and dairy. But people don't seem to have this kind of level of understanding or awareness or education, typically, unless someone as a third party outside observer can have an overview of your lifestyle and best advise. And especially now coming to low FODMAP, I think because it's so restrictive, it's really best to be managed through a professional who sort of understands what's going on and who can help you. Because it's not a diet you should follow it forever in terms of FODMAP, low FODMAP. But it's just more of a, let's call it a trial and error discovery basis to see what foods are really triggering and at what quantity as well, to determine what is troublesome for you, and then seeing what you can slowly add and slowly avoid. Because FODMAP will have a lot of foods on the no-no list, but it doesn't mean all of those are no-nos for you, and that's what we sort of have to work out through a trial and error basis. Now, the big word FODMAP, what does it mean? It basically is just an acronym, and it stands for fermentable oligosaccharides, disaccharides, monosaccharides, and polyols. And this is basically are short chain carbohydrates, which are sugars, that the small intestine absorbs poorly. So some people experience digestive distress after eating them, and the typical symptoms, which usually people class as IBS, would be cramping, diarrhea, constipation, stomach bloating, gas, and flatulence. So these are the most common symptoms people come with. And then we do a colonic, and then there's just candida flowing out of them. And then that tells me, okay, we need to do blood tests. We affirm that maybe you do or do not. But like I said, 8 to 9 times out of 10, people have a yeast intolerance too. And then that's a really good navigation to help focus on what to eliminate and then how to treat the body as well. So it usually works as like a 3-step process where you eliminate certain foods that are high in FODMAP, then you will slowly introduce them to see which ones are troublesome. So basically go from a blank canvas, you introduce a couple of things, see how you react, because like I said, there's like a 3-day window where your body can show symptoms, and sometimes instant and sometimes up to 3 days. So we need to obviously test that. And then once you really identify the true triggers or the ones that cause you the symptoms, then you can avoid them or limit them so you can obviously enjoy a worry-free lifestyle. So yeah. So sort of coming back to that, sort of back to the beginning of the podcast is, so now my big issue at the moment is, how does it all work? So mainstreaming and gut health is all saying, eat fermented foods, this is good for you, your gut's going to get strong. And I get all the people coming back and they're like, I'm feeling worse than ever. I've been following this fermentation thing. I've been making fermented foods at home. I've been eating a lot more foods that are really out of my palate. And then they go like, and I just feel terrible and my energy's low. And I'm thinking, yeah, because the key thing that gut health is just not speaking about at the moment is it customized to you as an individual, right? And I've asked a lot of, let's call it professionals, the top people in the industry about, okay, sure, people should eat fermented foods, but what about, or if they're subject to a yeast intolerance? And then people just don't really have an answer for me. And what I want to say is, or maybe hopefully this can get out there, is, we need to really customize our healing to our individual needs. And the starting point, I do think, is really great, is starting in the blood. And the starting point really for me with gut health is actually two things. It's doing blood tests and doing a colonic if you can and are not contraindicated. Because for me personally, I can tell so much about your body just by touching you, in terms of touching your abdomen and doing a physical observation. And I'll use and incorporate tools such as Chinese medicine and Tibetan medicine techniques, where I'll look into your eyes, I'll look at your tongue, I'll look at your face, I'll look at your overall constitution, how your body shape is, how you're doing, how's the muscle, how your muscles are in terms of the strength that it holds, how is your abdominal wall holding up, how are your organs doing, how's the shape of your belly button, and where's your belly button, and how is it placed on your abdomen. How do you carry yourself in your energy? How's your posture? And then from that, I get a lot of information. Of course, I'll ask you questions as well, just to sort of confirm my hypotheses. And then doing a colonic, and then I can match the outside to the inside to really get an insight. Because for me to date, colonic is the only modality I've discovered, and I say to date, that works under the hood of the vehicle, that can help me assess what's going on internally, that most people can't do or see. And sometimes people be like, I'm experiencing X, Y, and Z because of X, Y, and Z. And then I'll be like, that's not the case, because now that I've seen inside, it's a very, very different story. And yeah, more often than not, what people think is going on is not the reality from when I inspect the physical body. And so if you pair that with blood tests to find out what your allergies are, what your intolerances are, that can really, really, really be the first step to really rewarding yourself with gut health. And then through that, because I do nutrition and supplementation as well, through different modalities, whether it's the quantum quantum physics bioresonance technology, I can scan you using kinesiology and obviously understanding what comes out of you in your colonic, your fecal matter release. Then I do match all three together, and then I'm able to really find the right customized combination for you in terms of helping you with your gut health. And, then once we start fixing your gut health, a fun fact is, 70% of our immune system is found in our gut. So by improving our gut, we improve our immune system, which has all these positive knock-on effects onto the body and your health and how you handle yourself and your energy levels. It improves the endocrine system, so the hormones of the body, and also your mood. 95% of serotonin, like the happy hormone, is found in your gut as well. So just by doing a few corrective actions on your gut, knowing what to put in. And I always say to people, colonic hydrotherapy resets the body, it really starts you from scratch. But then if you're going to keep putting in the wrong foods into your vehicle, you're just going to keep resetting your body to a triggered-like environment and not achieve the long-term sustained results that I help people achieve. And then on top of it, just being a mentor and coach in terms of health, nutrition, wellness, mindset, then I keep people on track and also accountable. And then people, and most importantly, empowered as well. And then people know how to look after themselves. But I just, again, this sort of the always a long podcast because I can really talk about these things. But I just really want to say, like, you need to be mindful about what social media tells and dictates, because a lot of things are, this is good for you. But the question is it good for you? Like, you specifically as an individual, based on your lifestyle habits, environment, age, intake of diet, your stress levels, everything. Is it good for you? And this is sort of the, and let's call it a mindset awareness I'm trying to create, is are these things good for you? Because sometimes they're not, and we just have to live with that reality. But rather than doing guesswork, which a lot of people do, rather go to an expert and professional and let them help you, or in this case, let me help you. And the beauty with the work that I do is we can do it online. So you can be anywhere in the world, as well as you can come to the clinic in London, in central London, where I'm based. So, you don't have to fear that, like, oh, if you're overseas somewhere, like, oh, I wish I could come to London to do the work. The work can start online. There's a lot of techniques and information and tools that I have available that you can start from the comfort of your own home. And so, to summarize the theme is, yes, fermentation fundamentally in its concept is really good, but a lot of people suffer from yeast intolerance. And like I say, it's a very high statistical number that I see from the patients of years and years and years of doing blood tests. And we need to now be mindful that, yes, fermentation is good. Yeast intolerance / candida is quite high and on the rise. And we need to sort of recognize that we need to do a couple more steps in between, or let's just say there's a black box of steps that are missing in between the fermentation phase and supporting gut health, and first repairing your gut and cleansing your gut and detoxing your gut, and then starting to get to a point where we can strengthen it and incorporate different things like fermentation. So my wise words for today was just be careful before you start doing new things. First, see if it's right for you. Get some support or a mentor or a coach, or go for some treatments, detoxifying treatments, and just really see what other people know, because you'd be surprised. People in this field of work know a lot of things and a lot of amazing information, and that's why I continue to study, because it's just mind-blowing. And, I choose to share this information. Not everyone else does. But yeah, just be careful, because you don't want to be creating more damage to your gut that's already struggling and suffering, because everyone has gut health issues. It's pretty predominant, because it's the base or foundation of most health issues, if not all. And so, yeah. So just being mindful that, yes, you're probably going to hear and see and witness a lot of fermentation popping up with gut health, and eat tofu and eat this and eat that. And I just want you to go, after listening to this podcast, I'm going to think about that again. I'm really going to think about that, because maybe it's not the right thing for me. And maybe I need to do a blood test, and maybe I need to go get a colonic or a gut health cleanse, or colonic irrigation, and just see what do I really need and where my body is and where I'm on track. See it as an MOT for wherever you are in the stage of your health and in your age, and then take it from there. Right. So I felt a little bit more of a lecture today, and maybe it was because I'm really trying to get a point across, just be careful of all mainstreaming things. And yes, and some things sound good, and they know how to, in terms of media, create it to sound amazing, but just got to be mindful that maybe it's not the amazingness for you. Just like dating someone, isn't it? If we all wanted the same person, and if the same person was right for all of us, then we wouldn't be able to share. So, variety or unique things. Everyone has a unique defining factor of why they're attracted to someone else. And it's the same thing. We all have unique needs within our environment and our body and our health that needs us to be at our best and optimum. So make sure you're getting those right things to support you and help you to be the best version of yourself. And on that note, I'm going to go. So wherever you're in the world, thank you so much for listening to my little rant and lecture. But I really feel like I just wanted to create this point across because I can't seem to find this information anywhere. And like I say, the top people that I've asked don't really seem to like go, oh yeah, that makes sense actually. So I'm saying is be mindful. Don't just start doing something new because you think it's good for you and it's being sold that it's good for you. You need to check first if it's the right thing for you. And if it is, maybe you need to do a few steps before you can get there. All right. So wherever you're in the world, I look forward to you coming back. And if you can, please like and subscribe to this podcast because it's really helpful for me to know that I'm doing I'm doing the right thing and I can get the motivation and feedback to continue the mission. And I hope to see you next week for the new episode. Over and out. This is Freudenberg at the Freud Wellness podcast, where I am consciously empowering your body and mind through wellness.